Hi scholars, welcome to our read aloud for Matilda. We are on chapters 16 and 17. This is Miss Honey's Cottage. So let's get started. I'm really excited to read more about Miss Honey. Miss Honey's Cottage. Miss Honey joined Matilda outside the school gates, and the two of them walked in silence through the village high street. They passed the greengrocer with his window full of apples and oranges, and the butcher with bloody lumps of meat on display and naked chickens hanging up, and the small bank, and the grocery store, and the electrical shop. And they came out of the other side of the village, on top of the narrow county road, where there were no people anymore, and very few motor cars. And now that they were alone, Matilda, all of a sudden, became wildly animated. It seemed as though a valve had burst inside of her with a great gush of energy was being released. She trotted beside Miss Honey, with the wild little hops of her fingers flew, as if she would scatter them to four winds, and her four words went off like fireworks with terrific speed. It was Miss Honey, this and Miss Honey that, it was Miss Honey and this and Miss Honey, that Miss Honey, and I do, and honestly, I feel I could move anything in the world, not just tipping over the glass and little things like that. I feel I could topple tables and chairs, Miss Honey, even when people are sitting in the chairs. I think I could push them over, and bigger things too, much bigger things than chairs and tables. I only have to take a moment to get my eyes stronger, then I could push it out. This strongness at anything at all. So as long as I'm staring at it hard enough, I have to stare at it very hard, Miss Honey, very, very hard, and then I can feel it all happening behind my eyes, and my eyes got hot just enough. They were burning. But don't mind that in the least, Miss Honey. Calm yourself down, child. Calm yourself down, Miss Honey said. Let us not get over ourselves too worked up so early in the proceedings. But you do think it's interesting, don't you, Miss Honey? Oh, it is interesting, all right, Miss Honey said. It is more than interesting, but we must tread very carefully from now on, Matilda. Why would we tread carefully, Miss Honey? Because we're playing with very mysterious forces, and child we know nothing about. I don't think they are evil. They may be good, but may even be divine. But whether they are not, let us handle them carefully. These are the wise words from the wise old bird, but Matilda was too steamed up to see that way. I don't see why we have to be so careful, she said, still helping about it. I'm trying to explain to you, Miss Honey said patiently, that we are dealing with the unknown. It is an unexplainable thing. The right word for it is phenomenon. It's a phenomenon. Am I a phenomenon? Matilda asked. It's quite possible that you are, Miss Honey said, but I'd rather that you don't think about it yourself, about anything particular at the moment. What I thought we might do is explore the phenomenon a little further, just the two of us together, but making sure we are taking things carefully all the time. You want me to do some more of it then, Miss Honey? That is what I'm tempted to suggest, Miss Honey said curiously. Goody good, Matilda said. I myself, Miss Honey said, am probably far more bowled over by what you do than you are. And I'm trying to find some reasonable explanation. Such as what? Asked Miss Honey. Such as whether it's got something to do with the fact that you are quite exceptionally precocious. What exactly does that word mean? Matilda said. A precocious child, Miss Honey said, is one that shows amazing intelligence early on. You are, unbelievably, precocious child. Am I really? Matilda asked. Of course you are. You must be aware of that. Look at your reading. Look at your mathematics. I suppose you're right, Matilda said. Miss Honey marveled at the child's lack of conceit and self-consciousness. I can't help wondering, she said, whether this sudden ability that has come to you of being able to move an object without touching it, whether it might not have something to do with your brain power. You mean there might not be room in my head for all those brains, so something has to push it out? That's not quite what I mean, Miss Honey said, smiling. But whatever happens, and I say it again, we must tread carefully from now on, and I have forgotten the strange, distant glimmer in your face after you tipped over the glass. Do you think doing it could actually hurt me? Is that what you're thinking, Miss Honey? It made me feel pretty peculiar, didn't it? It made me feel lovely, Matilda said. For a moment or two, I was flying past the stars with silver wings. I told you that. And I shall tell you something else, Miss Honey. It was easier the second time. Much easier. I think it's like anything else. The more you practice it, the easier it gets. Miss Honey was walking slowly so that the small child could keep up with her without trotting too fast, and it was very peaceful out in the narrow road now that the village was behind them. It was one of those golden autumn afternoons, and there were blackberries and splashes of old man's beard in the hedges, and the hawthorn berries were ripening and the scarlet birds where cold winter came along. There were the tall trees here and there on the other side, oak and sycamore and the ash, occasionally a sweet chestnut. Miss Honey, wishing to change the subject for the moment, gave all the names of these to Matilda and taught her how to recognize them by the shape of their leaves and the pattern of the bark on their trunks. Matilda took this all in and stored the knowledge carefully in her mind. They came finally to a gap in the hedge of the left-hand side of the road, where there were 5 barred gates. This way, Miss Honey said, and they opened the gate and let Matilda through and closed it again. They were now walking along a narrow lane that was no more than a rutted cart truck. There was a high hedge of hazel on either side, and you could see clusters of ripe brown nuts and their green jackets. The squirrels would be collecting them all very soon, Miss Honey said, storing them away carefully for the bleak month ahead. You mean you live down here? Matilda asked. I do, Miss Honey replied, but she said no more. Matilda had never once stopped to think about where Miss Honey might be living. She had always regarded her purely as a teacher, a person who turned up out of nowhere, taught the school, and then went away again. Do any of us children, she wondered, ever stop to ask ourselves where our teachers go when school is over for the day? Do we ever wonder if they live alone, or if there's a mother at home, or a sister, or a husband? Do you live all by yourself, Miss Honey? She asked. Yes, Miss Honey said, very much so. They were walking over a deep sun-baked mud trucks in the lane, and you had to watch where you put your feet if you didn't want to twist your ankle. There were very few small birds around in the hazel branches, but that was all. It's just a farm laborer's cottage, Miss Honey said. You mustn't expect too much of it. We're nearly here. They came to a small green gate, half buried in the hedge on the right and almost hidden over the hanging hazel branches. Miss Honey paused with one hand on the gate and said, There it is. That's where I live. Matilda saw a narrow dirt path leading to a tiny red brick cottage. The cottage was so small, it looked more like a dollhouse than a human dwelling. The bricks it was built of were old, crumbly, and very pale red. It had a very green slate roof and one small chimney, and there were 2 little windows at the front. Each window was larger than a sheet of a tabloid newspaper, and there was clearly no upstairs to the place. On either side of the path, there was wilderness and nettles and blackberry thorns and long brown grass. An enormous oak tree stood overshadowing the cottage. Its massive spreading branches seemed to be enfolding and embracing tiny buildings, and perhaps hiding it well from the rest of the world. Miss Honey, with one hand on the gate, which had not been opened, turned to Matilda and said, A poet called Dylan Thomas wrote some lines that I think every time I walk up this path. Matilda waited, and Miss Honey, in a rather wonderful, slow voice, began reciting the poem. Never and never, my girl riding far and near, in the land of the hearthstone tales, and spelled asleep. Fear of believe that the wolf is the sleep-white hood, looping and bleeding through, roughly, like blithery shall leap, my dear, my dear. Out of a lair in the flock leaves and the dew-dripped year, to eat your heart in the house in a rosy wood. There was a moment of silence, and Matilda, who had never before heard great romantic poetry spoken aloud, was profoundly moved. It's like music, she whispered. It's like music. It is music, Miss Honey said. And then, as though embarrassed at having relieved such a secret part of herself, she quickly pushed open the gate and walked up the path. Matilda hung back. She was a bit frightened at the place now. It seemed so unreal and remote and fantastic and totally away from this earth. It was an illustration of Grimm and Hans Andersen. It was the house where the poor woodcutter lived, and the Hansel and Gretel, and where the Red Riding Hood's grandmother lived. And it was also the house of the 7 dwarfs and the 3 bears and the rest of them. It was straight out of a fairy tale. Come along, my dear, Miss Honey called back, and Matilda followed her up the path. The front door was covered with flaky green paint, and there was no keyhole. Miss Honey simply lifted the latch and pushed open the door and went in. Although she was not a tall woman, she had to stoop low to get through the doorway. Matilda went after her and found herself in what seemed to be a dark, narrow tunnel. You can come through the kitchen and help me make tea, Miss Honey said, and she led the way along the tunnel into the kitchen. That is if you could call it a kitchen. It was no much bigger than a good-sized clothes cupboard, and there was one small window and the back wall sink under the window, but there were no taps over the sink. Against another wall was a shelf, presumably for preparing food, and there was a single cupboard above the shelf. On the shelf, there stood a Primus stove. So there's Miss Honey's kitchen and her only shelf. A saucepan and a half-full bottle of milk. A Primus is a little camping stove that you fill with paraffin, and you light it at the top and pump it for the pressure for the flame. You can get some water. Well, I'll light the Primus, Miss Honey said. The well is out the back. Take the bucket. Here it is. You'll find the rope in the well. Just hook the bucket at the end of the rope and lower it down. But don't fall in yourself, Matilda. Resumed the Nevernow, took the bucket and carried it out into the back garden. The well had a little wooden roof over it and a simple winding device. And there, the rope dangling into the dark bottomless hole. Matilda pulled up the rope and hooked it and handled the bucket at the end of it. Then she lowered it until she heard a splash, and the rope went slack. She pulled it up again, and lo and behold, there was water in the bucket. Is this enough? She asked, carrying it in. Just about, Miss Honey said. I don't suppose you've ever done that before. Never, Matilda said. It's fun. How do you get enough water for your bath? I don't take a bath, Miss Honey said. I wash standing up. I get a bucket of water, and I heat it in the little stove, and I strip and wash myself all over. Do you honestly do that? Matilda asked. Of course I do, Miss Honey said. Every poor person in England used to wash that way until not so very long ago, and they didn't have a Primus. They had to heat the water up over the fire and the hearth. Are you poor, Miss Honey? Yes, Miss Honey said. Very. It's a good little stove, isn't it? The Primus was roaring away with powerful blue flame, and already the water in the saucepan was beginning to bubble. Miss Honey got a teapot from the cupboard and put some tea leaves into it. She also found half a small loaf of brown bread. She cut 2 thin slices, and then, from a plastic container, she took some margarine and spread it on the bread. Margarine, Matilda thought. She really must be poor. Miss Honey found a tray on it and put 2 mugs, the teapot, half a bottle of milk, and a plate with 2 slices of bread. I'm afraid I don't have any sugar, she said. I never use it. That's all right, Matilda said. In her wisdom, she seemed to be aware of the delicacy of the situation, and she was taking great care not to say anything to embarrass her companion. Let's have it in the sitting room, Miss Honey said, picking up the tray and leading the way out of the kitchen and down a dark little tunnel into the room at the front. Matilda followed her, but just inside the doorway to the so-called sitting room, she stopped and stared around with the absolute amazement. The room was small and square and bare as a prison cell. The pale daylight that entered came in from a single tiny window in the front wall, but there were no curtains. The only object in the entire room were 2 upturned wooden boxes to serve as chairs, a third box between them for a table. That was all. There was no pictures on the wall, no carpet on the floor, only unpolished wooden planks. And there were gaps between the planks where dust and bins of grimes had gathered. The ceiling was so low that with the jump, Matilda could touch it with her fingertips. The walls were white, with whiteness didn't look like paint. Matilda rubbed her palm against it, and the white powder came off on her skin. It was whitewash, the cheap stuff that is used in cowsheds and stables and hen houses. Matilda was appalled. Was this really where her neat and trimly dressed schoolteacher lived? Was this all she had to come back after a day's work? It was unbelievable. And what was the reason for it? There was something very strange going on around here, surely. Miss Honey put the tray on the upturned box. Sit down, my dear, sit down, she said, and we'll have a nice hot cup of tea. Help yourself to bread. Both slices are for you. I never eat anything when I get home. I have a good old tuck-in at the school lunch that keeps me going until the next morning. Matilda perched herself carefully on an upturned box, and more politeness than anything else took a slice of bread and margarine and started to eat it. At home, she would have been having buttered toast, strawberry jam, and probably a piece of sponge cake to round it off. And yet, this was somehow more fun. There was a mysterious here in the house, and great mystery. There was no doubt about that, and Matilda was longing to find out what it was. Miss Honey poured the tea and added a little milk to both cups. She appeared to be not in the least ill at the ease of sitting at the upturned box in the bare room, drinking tea out of a mug that she balanced on her knee. You know, she said, I've been thinking very hard about what you did with that glass. It's a great power you have given my child, you know that. Yes, Miss Honey, I do, Matilda said, chewing her bread of margarine. So, as far as I know, Miss Honey went on, nobody in the history of the world has ever been able to compel an object or move without touching it, or blowing it, or using any outside help at all. Matilda nodded and said nothing. The fascinating thing, Miss Honey said, would be to find out the real limit of this power of yours. Oh, I know you think you can just move about anything there is, but I have my doubts about that. I'd love to try something really huge, Matilda said. What about distance? Miss Honey asked. You always have to be close to the thing you are pushing. I simply don't know, Matilda said, but it would be fun to find out. Next chapter, Miss Honey's story. Let me put my glasses on, just so I can be sure. Okay, probably should have had these on before, but that's okay. Miss Honey's story. We mustn't hurry this, Miss Honey said, so let's have another cup of tea. And do eat that other slice of bread, you must be hungry. Matilda took the second slice and started eating it slowly. The margarine wasn't all bad. She doubted whether she could have told the difference if she had known. Miss Honey said suddenly, Do they pay you very badly at our school? Mrs. Honey looked up sharply. Not too badly, she said. I get about the same as the others. But it must still be very little if you are so dreadfully poor, Matilda said. Do all the teachers live like this, with no furniture and no kitchen and no stove and no bathroom? No, they don't, Miss Honey said rather stiffly. I just happen to be the exception. I accept you just happen to like living in a very simple way, Matilda said, probing a little further. It must make house cleaning an awful lot easier if you don't have furniture to polish or any of those silly little ornaments lying around and have to be dusted every day. And I suppose you don't have a fridge and you don't have to go out and buy all sorts of junky things like eggs and mayonnaise and ice cream to fill up with. It must save a terrific lot of shopping. At this point, Matilda noticed that Miss Honey's face had gone all tight and peculiar looking. Her whole body became rigid. Her shoulders were hunched, her high and her lips were pressed tight, and they sat gripping her mug in both hands, staring down at it as if it was searching for a way to answer those not so quite innocent questions. There followed a long and embarrassing silence. In the sparse of 30 seconds, the atmosphere of the room changed completely, and now it was vibrating with awkwardness and secrets. Matilda said, I'm very sorry I asked you those questions, Miss Honey. It's not none of my business. At this, Miss Honey seemed to rouse herself. She gave a shake of her shoulders, and very carefully she sat her mug on the tray. Why shouldn't you ask, she said. You are bound to ask in the end, and you're much too bright not to have wondered. Perhaps I even wanted you to ask. Maybe this is why I invited you here after all. As a matter of fact, you were the first visitor to come to my cottage ever since I moved 2 years ago. Matilda said nothing. She could feel the tension growing and growing in the room. You are so much more wiser than your years, my dear, Miss Honey went on. That quite staggers me. Although you look like a child, you're not really a child at all because you mind your powers reasoning seem to be fully grown up. So I suppose we might call you a grown-up child, if you see what I mean. Matilda did not say anything. She was waiting for what was coming next. Up to now, Miss Honey went on, I have found it impossible to talk to anyone about my problems. I couldn't face the embarrassment. And anyway, I lacked the courage. Any courage I had knocked out of me when I was young. But now all of a sudden, I have sort of a desperate wish to tell everything to somebody. I know you were only a tiny girl, but there is some kind of magic in you somewhere. I've seen it with my own eyes. Matilda became very alert. The voice she was hearing was surely crying out for help. It must be. It had to be. Their voice spoke again. Have some more tea, I said. I think there's still a drop left. Matilda nodded. Miss Honey poured tea into both mugs and added milk. Again, she cupped her own mug in both hands and sat there sipping. There was a quite long silence before she said, May I tell you a story? Of course, Matilda said. I am 23 years old, Miss Honey said, and when I was born, my father was a doctor in the village. We had a nice old house, quite large, red brick. It's tucked away in the woods behind the hills. I don't think you know it. Matilda kept silent. I was born there, Miss Honey said, and there came the first tragedy. My mother died when I was 2. My father, a busy doctor, had to have someone to run the house and look after me, so he invited my mother's unmarried sister, my aunt, to come live with us. She agreed, and she came. Matilda was listening intently. How old was the aunt when she moved in, she asked. Not very old, Miss Honey said. I say about 30. I hated her right from the start. I missed my mother terribly, and the aunt was not a kind person. My father didn't know that because he was hardly ever around, but when he did an appearance, the aunt behaved differently. Miss Honey paused and sipped her tea. I think that's why I'm telling you all this, she said, embarrassed. Go on, Matilda said, please. Well, Miss Honey said, then came the second tragedy. When I was 5, my father died very suddenly. One day, he was there, and the next day he was gone. And so I was left to live alone with my aunt. She became my legal guardian. She had all the powers of the parent over me, and in some way or another, she became the actual owner of the house. How did your father die? Matilda asked. It is interesting you should ask that, Miss Honey said. I myself was way too young to question at the time, and I find out later that there was a good deal of mystery surrounding his death. Didn't they know how he died? Matilda asked. Well, not exactly, Miss Honey said, hesitating. You see, no one could believe that he would never have done it. He was such a very sane and sensible man. Done what? Matilda. Killed himself. Matilda was stunned. Did he? She gasped. That's what it looked like, Miss Honey said. But who knows, she shrugged and turned away and stared out the tiny window. I know what you're thinking, Matilda. You're thinking that the aunt killed him and made it look as that if he'd done it himself. I'm not thinking anything, Miss Honey said. One mustn't never think things like that without proof. The little room became quiet. Matilda noticed that the hand clasping the mugs were trembling slightly. What happened after that? She asked. What happened when you left alone with the aunt? Wasn't she nice to you? Nice, Miss Honey said. She was a demon. As soon as my father was out of the way, she became a holy terror. My life was a nightmare. What did she do to you? Matilda asked. I don't want to talk about it, Miss Honey said. It's too horrible. But in the end, I became so frightened of her, I used to start shaking, and she came in the room. You must understand, I was never a strong character like you. I was always shy and retrying. Didn't you have any other relations? Matilda asked. relations. Any uncles or aunts or grannies who would come to see you? None that I knew about, Miss Honey said. They were all either dead or they'd gone to Australia. And that's still the way it is now, I'm afraid. So you grew up in that house alone with your aunt, Matilda said. But you must have gone to school. Of course, Miss Honey said. I went to the same school you're going to now. But I lived at home. Miss Honey paused and stared down her empty tea mug. I think that's what I'm trying to explain to you, she says, is that over the years I became so completely cowed and dominated by this monster of my aunt that when I was older, no matter what it was, I obeyed it instantly. That can happen, you know. And by the time I was 10, I became her slave. I did all the housework. I made her bed. I washed and ironed for her. I did all the cooking. I'd learned how to do everything. But surely you have complained to somebody, Matilda said. To whom? Miss Honey said. And anyway, I was far too terrified to complain. I told you I was her slave. Did she beat you? Let's not go into details, Miss Honey said. How simply awful, Matilda said. Did you cry nearly all the time? Only when I was alone, Miss Honey said. I wasn't allowed to cry in front of her, but I lived in fear. What happened when you left school? Matilda asked. I was a bright pupil, Miss Honey said. I could have easily got into university, but there was no question of that. Why not, Miss Honey? Because I was needed at home to do the work. And how did you become a teacher? Matilda asked. There is a teacher's training college in Reading, Miss Honey said. That's only 40 minutes bus ride away from here. I was allowed to go there on the condition I came straight home every afternoon to do the washing and ironing and to clean the house and cook supper. How old were you then? Matilda asked. When I went into teaching training, I was 18, Miss Honey said. You could have just packed up and walked away, Matilda said. Not until I got a job, Miss Honey said. And don't forget, I was then dominated by my aunt to such extent that I couldn't have dared. You can't imagine. Very strong personality. Turns you into jello. So that's it. That's the sad story of my life. Now I've talked enough. Please don't stop, Matilda. You haven't finished yet. How did you manage to get away from her in the end and come to live in this funny house? Ah, that's something, Miss Honey said. I was proud of that. Tell me, Matilda. Well, Miss Honey said, when I got my teacher's job, the aunt told me that I owed her a lot of money. I asked her why. She said, because I've been feeding you for all these years and buying you shoes and your clothes. She told me it added up thousands, and I had to pay her back by giving her a salary for the next 10 years. I'll give you £1 a pocket week, she said, but that's all you're going to get. She even arranged with the school authorities to have my salary paid directly into her own bank. She made me sign the paper. You shouldn't have done that, Matilda said. Your salary was a chance of freedom. I know, Miss Honey said. But by then, I had been her slave nearly all my life that I hadn't the courage or guts to say no. I was still petrified of her. She could still hurt me badly. So how did you manage to escape? Matilda asked. Ah, Miss Honey said, smiling for the first time. That was 2 years ago. It was my greatest triumph. Please tell me, Matilda said. I urged to get up very clearly to go on walks by myself. My aunt was still asleep, Miss Honey said. And one day I came across this tiny cottage. It was empty. I found who owned it. It was a farmer. I went to see the farmers also get up very early. He was milking his cows, and I asked him if I could rent his cottage. You can't live there, he cried. It's got no conveniences, no running water, no nothing. I want to live there, I said. I'm not romantic. I've fallen in love with it. I'm a romantic. I've fallen in love with it. Please rent it to me. You're mad, he said. But if you insist, welcome to it. The rent will be 10 pence a week. Here's 1 month's rent in advance, I said, giving him 40 pence. And thank you so much. How super, Matilda cried. So suddenly you had to pull a house on your own. But how did you pluck up the courage to tell the aunt? That was tough, Miss Honey said. But I steeled myself to do it. One night after I cooked her supper, I went upstairs, packed a few things into a Western cardboard box, and came downstairs and announced I was leaving. I rented a house, I said. My aunt exploded. Rented a house, she shouted. How can you rent a house when you only have £1 a week in the world? I've done it, I said. And how are you going to buy food for yourself? I'll manage. I mumbled and rushed out of the front door. Oh, Well done, you, she cried. So you're free at last. I was free at last, Miss Honey said. I can't tell you how wonderful it was. But you have really managed to live here on £1 a week for 2 years? Matilda asked. I most certainly have, Miss Honey said. I pay 10 pence rent, and the rest just about buys me paraffin for my stove and for my lamp, a little bit of milk and tea and bread and margarine. That's all I really need. As I told you, I have a jolly good tuck-in at the school lunch. Matilda stared at her. What a marvelous, brave thing Miss Honey had done. Suddenly she was a heroine in Miss Matilda's eyes. It's awfully cold in the winter, she asked. I've got my little paraffin stove, Miss Honey said. You'd be surprised how snug I can make it in here. Do you have a bed, Miss Honey? Well, not exactly, Miss Honey said, smiling again. But they say it's very healthy to sleep on a hard surface. All at once, Matilda was able to see the whole situation in absolute clarity. Miss Honey needed help. There was no way she could go existing like this infinitely. You would be a lot better, Miss Honey said, that if you gave up your new job and unemployment money. I would never do that, Miss Honey said. I love teaching. That's this awful Aunt Matilda said. I suppose she is still living in your lovely old house. Very much so, Miss Honey said. She's still about 50. She'll be around for a long time yet. And do you think your father really meant for her to leave her to own the house forever? I'm quite sure he didn't, Miss Honey said. Parents will often give the guardian the right to occupy the house for a certain length of time, but it is nearly always left in trust for the child. Then it becomes the child's property when she grows up. That surely is your house, Matilda said. My father's will was never found, Miss Honey said. It looks as though somebody destroyed it. No prizes for guessing who, Matilda said. No prizes, Miss Honey. But if there is no will, Miss Honey, then surely house goes automatically to you. You're the next kin. I know I am, Miss Honey said, but my aunt produced a piece of paper, supposedly written by my father, saying that he leaves the house to his sister-in-law in return for her kindness in looking after me. I'm certain it's forgery, but no one can prove it. Couldn't you try, Matilda said. Couldn't you hire a good lawyer and make a fight of it? I don't have the money to do that, Miss Honey said. And you must remember that this aunt of mine is a respected figure in the community. She has a lot of influence. Who is she? Matilda asked. Miss Honey hesitated a moment. Then she said softly, Miss Trunchbull. The names. Wow, what a packed information we got from Miss Honey. Miss Trunchbull is Miss Honey's aunt. Treated her very badly, faked a letter that the father left the house to her. It was so just this awful human being. So interested to see how Matilda and Miss Honey get through this. Keep reading, and I will be back to read the next chapters. I'm really excited. Bye, guys.